Well, good morning. Well, I guess it's good morning now. I don't know when you'll be watching this, but today we are going to talk about Chapter 6, the skeletal system and bone tissue. It starts on page 169 in your textbook. I'm going to use some online images since I'm not there with the textbook, but just as a review, we don't have class Tuesday the 23rd or Tuesday the 24th for the actual in-class portion. Thursday the 25th, you will have lab. The expectation is that you make sure you are done with labs 9 and 10 by the time that I come back. Our exam, let me just pull up this calendar. Okay. You can see my parents' birthday are looking at this. Okay, so I will be gone Tuesday the 23rd. Thursday the 25th, your job is to make sure labs 9 and 10 are done. If I were you, I would probably complete the written portion of the lab before you go so that you can spend the entire time that you're in lab actually getting your hands on the bones and everything else. Thursday the 3rd, I will be back and I will be checking to make sure those labs are done and getting them graded in the grade book. And then Thursday, March 10th is when we're going to have our test over the bones in lab. So make sure that you're getting your hands on all the bones. The test over that stuff is going to be live actual bones. So it's not going to be a lot of fill in the blank stuff. It's going to be identification. So we're kind of switching over into that. So as far as the class goes for our next test, which will probably be on the 8th, you're going to need to really focus on the class portion. So don't focus on identification for the class portion, but make sure you know the definitions, make sure you understand the content. We're going to talk about some hormones today. You're definitely going to be able to need to list some of that off. I will be sending you some study guides as well, so fill those out. But the lab is going to be identification. So for example, when we talked about the skull, you'll have to be able to identify the different bones on the skull or the different landmarks. When we look at long bones, you need to identify what bone it is, what side the bone is from, the medial and lateral sides of the bones if we're talking about surface markings, what the trochanters are, what the tubercles are. So you will be able to, well, you won't be able to, you need to be able to identify all of those things within the lab on the bones. So make sure that when you're in lab, you're spending time with your hands on the bones and you're practicing a lot of that. So, starting on page 170, we're going to talk about the functions of bone and the skeletal system. So there are 6 main functions of the skeletal system. Number 1 is going to be support, and number 2 is going to be protection. So I think these two are the obvious ones that everybody thinks of. So for support, the skeleton serves as the structural framework for the body, providing attachment points for the tendons of skeletal muscles. It's going to hold you up. Obviously, you couldn't move unless your skeletal muscles had an anchor for movement, so that's vital and important. Protection, your skeletal system is obviously going to protect your major organs. You think about your rib cage for the organs in your chest. You think about, your cranial cavity. Number 3 is going to be assistance in movement. Again, you really can't move your skeletal muscles without attachment points. Number 4 is going to be mineral homeostasis. This is the one that everybody seems to forget about, and in my opinion is one of the most important ones. So the bone is going to be our storage place for minerals, especially calcium and phosphorus. It's going to store about 99% of the body's calcium. Calcium is vital in contraction of muscles, so we need calcium to contract and relax muscles, and if our calcium storage is out of whack, we have some big time problems. So we'll talk about that a little bit more in the chapter. Number 5 is going to be blood cell production. So we have red bone marrow that is stored within the bone, and there is a process called hemopoiesis, which is basically blood making. So hemo means blood, poiesis means making. So red marrow is going to be stimulated by other hormones, and it's going to make different cells. So the bone marrow has blood cells, adipocytes, fibroblasts, and macrophages. stored within. So depending on the trigger hormone or stimulus, it's going to help make all of those cells that come after those. The marrow is going to be present in the bones of the fetus, the pelvic bones, ribs, sternum, vertebrae, skull, and the ends of the really long bones of like your humerus and femur is where this red bone marrow is going to be stored. There is also going to be triglyceride storage. This is another one that everybody forgets about. So there is yellow bone marrow, which is mainly going to be made up of adipose cells, which is going to store triglycerides. So there is some fat storage within your bones as well. So 6 functions: support, protection, assistance in movement, mineral homeostasis, blood cell production, triglyceride storage. As we move to the parts of a long bone, we have a few different sections of bone. So this is going to be the picture in your book on page 171. Oops, looks like the picture that I'm trying to find. Okay. So as far as looking at a long bone, we have some different parts. So the biggest part that comes to mind for most people, I think, is this diaphysis. So the diaphysis is going to be the long, skinny portion of the bone. Now, on the other part of the things that everyone thinks about, you're going to think about the epiphysis. So the epiphysis is going to be kind of the ends of the bone where the condyles and stuff are. And then this kind of triangular portion is going to be the metaphysis. So epiphysis is at the end. Metaphysis is kind of going into the main shaft of the bone, which is also called the diaphysis. On some of these things, you can see sometimes what's called an epiphyseal line, also known as a growth plate. So that is going to be kind of right in these areas. You can see this is the area where you have interstitial growth, aka the bone's getting longer. This is problematic if you're a child and you break this portion of your bone because it can stunt bone growth early and you won't grow as tall as you're supposed to be. So if it's on like something like your leg, you're going to be uneven as you grow. So again, those parts, epiphysis, metaphysis, diaphysis, and then the epiphyseal line, which is also known as the growth plate. Another photo of some of this. You'll see that they use the words proximal epiphysis and distal epiphysis. So proximal, again, means closer kind of to the body's core. Distal is going to be further away. So this proximal epiphysis would be the part that's closest to articulating with your midline, and then distal is going to probably articulate with everything else. What you'll notice is it's showing you where red bone marrow is and then where yellow bone marrow is. So red bone marrow is going to be housed within those epiphyses and metaphyses of the bone. Yellow bone marrow is going to be stored kind of within the diaphysis or shaft of everything. You'll also see that it points out spongy bone and compact bone. So spongy bone is all of this bone that has trabeculae and spaces in between it for red bone marrow to be housed. Compact bone is going to be that harder stuff that we discussed in class. So compact bone is going to form the outsides of the bone, and this is going to be that hard, really protective layer that we talked about. Here's another example of what the inside of a bone looks like. So here would be that spongy bone. So all the red bone marrow would be through here. Here's the compact bone. So the red marrow would be all through kind of this space. This would have the yellow bone marrow. Here's the compact bone on the outside over here. And this would be considered the proximal epiphysis. This would also be a proximal epiphysis. This area is going to be the metaphysis, and then this is kind of where the diaphysis starts. you can sort of pick up where the epiphyseal line was on this bone. This is an adult bone, it looks like, so it's kind of gone. The interesting thing about this spongy bone is it's not a static figure. So it's always remodeling itself, it's always replacing itself, it's always changing directions. You'll notice these fibers are kind of crisscross and orientated in different planes. That's to form the structural framework of the bone. So depending on how you're kind of dispersing weight across everything is how this bone shape will form, and you'll get all of these different patterns to help support you. So bone is a living tissue that's constantly remodeling itself, and it's constantly changing itself depending on what kind of stress that you are putting on top of it. I think there's one more photo in here that I wanted to show you. Where did it go? Oh, yeah. This is a look kind of from the top in, so this would be more of a cross-section view so you can see what the inside of that bone looks like. Here's another view of that spongy bone, and then this would be that compact bone with the space for marrow in there. So that is the anatomy of long bones. So as you look at this, this is on page 170, you're going to need to be very familiar with these words. The functions and the anatomy of long bones are all going to be stuff that's going to be in your in-class test, so make sure you study that. So the diaphysis is, and I'm on page 170 on the right-hand side of the page, is the bone's shaft or body. So it's the long cylindrical main portion of the bone. The epiphyses are going to be the proximal and distal ends of the bones. So proximal closer to your core, distal further away. The metaphyses is going to be between the diaphyses and the epiphyses. And this is the area that's going to contain the epiphyseal growth plate. So this is a layer of hyaline cartilage that allows the bone to grow in length. So that's called interstitial growth. Articular cartilage is going to be the thin layer of hyaline cartilage covering the epiphysis where the bone forms a joint. So the stuff that makes up joints is hyaline cartilage, remember that. Anytime that this stuff is damaged, remember that cartilage is avascular. So when this type of cartilage is damaged, we have a tough time repairing it because there's no blood flow to that area. The periosteum is going to be the tough area that surrounds the bone. So this is going to be the tough, hard layer. You'll notice it is comprised of an outer fibrous layer and an inner osteogenic layer that consists of cells. So in the periosteum is where we can do the growth where we get wider. So bone growing in length is going to happen in that metaphyseal area because that's where the epiphyseal growth plate is. So the bone is going to get larger in the sense that it's getting longer. In the periosteum, we have an inner osteogenic layer. This is called oppositional growth, so it's getting wider. Also on the periosteum is something called Sharpie's fibers, which are thick bundles of collagen that extend from the periosteum into the bone. So this is how the periosteum is attached to the actual bone itself. There is a endosteum, which is going to be the inside of the bone, and then there's a medullary cavity, which is where the marrow is stored. Moving on to the histology of bone tissue. So there is going to be some different parts that we're going to talk of in some of these pictures. This again is going to be in class test material, so make sure you know this section inside and out. So bone is a type of connective tissue. I would definitely be able to answer that question. So it is going to have a bunch of extracellular matrix, and it is going to have mineral salts all through it. So the most common mineral salt is going to be calcium phosphate, and it's going to also combine with calcium hydroxide to form crystals of hydroxyapatite. So if you look at that part of it, those minerals are going to come together and they are going to crystallize and harden, and that's called calcification. So bone's hardness is going to depend on the crystallized mineral salts that are within, and the bone's flexibility is going to depend on how many collagen fibers it has. So the collagen fibers are going to kind of run through the bone, and when you think of like if you looked at when they're doing construction or laying concrete down, you'll notice there's always a framework within the stuff that they're pouring down. That's going to be kind of analogous to the collagen fibers that are running through. So you have to have a little bit of flexibility. It has to be able to, ebb and flow. Otherwise, it would just snap. So as we go through some of this tissue, there are going to be some different kinds of cells. I think it's kind of easier to describe it via picture first, and then we can go back through the pages and define. So we are looking at this image on page 174, and this is the actual kind of image. So this is called, this is all in compact bone, so this is going to be the hard bone on the outside. You'll see where the spongy bone kind of happens in here. These are called haversian or osteon systems. So it's important to realize that bone is a living material. It's a living thing. There are blood vessels and veins that travel all through, as well as nerves. And you'll notice these little circular areas. So these are called osteons. So in the middle of an osteon, you're going to have blood vessels that help feed this osteon. Now, the osteon is going to be made up of a bunch of osteocytes. So these things are kind of these little nucleated areas within the cell. So the osteocytes, you'll notice, have these kind of projections coming off of them. There are things called canaliculi. Now, it's not this part of the osteocyte. It's going to be this space, these areas. So kind of not the cell itself, so not these projections, but the spaces around those projections. That is a canaliculi. What that word means is basically just small channel or duct. So it's these channels you'll see here kind of that run in between the different types of cells. So those are called canaliculi. Then there is something called a lacuna. So the canaliculi are kind of the ones running over here. These areas are going to be called lacuna. So these are the areas kind of running with the cell. A lacuna is just another way of saying an unfilled interspace or gap. That's all that word means. You're also going to see some different words. You'll see some concentric lamellae, all these different types of lamellae. What a lamella is it's just a thin layer or membrane. So that's all that it is. You'll see it kind of marking some of these areas. So as you look through this bone, you'll see some different words. So we've defined these blood vessels, and osteon is this area of osteocytes that are going to be surrounding this blood vessel. It's going to be full of what we call concentric lamellae. Concentric means sharing the same center. So like these would be concentric to this blood vessel. These would be concentric to this blood vessel. This group would be concentric to this blood vessel. So you see these circles. So all of that would be called kind of concentric. So as you're looking at these little tissue membranes that flow, that's going to be called concentric lamellae. So as you look, these areas, these kind of light tan areas, are going to be the lamellae, concentric to the center. Then there's going to be outer circumferential lamellae. Those are going to be ones that are going to be around the whole bone. So they're running in a group together. And then there's going to be interstitial lamellae where there's really no central circle. So like this stuff would be interstitial, interstitial, interstitial. So that is what those are. Here are those different layers that we talked about just before this. So the periosteum is that fiber membrane. Here's the Sharpie's fibers that attach that to the actual bone tissue. There's going to be an outer fibrous layer where those tendons attach, and then an inner osteogenic layer. So this is how we have oppositional growth, aka the cell is going to get wider. You'll see the term osteocyte. An osteocyte is a mature bone cell. In here, you're also going to see something called a perforating canal. This is where the blood vessels are going to run into the bone. That's also called like a Volkmann's canal, is something that you'll probably see. Okay. So as we look at some of this, okay, so this would be an osteon or Haversian canal. So all of the tissue space would be concentric lamellae. So this would be concentric lamellae. These canaliculi, again, a canaliculi is a small channel or duct. Those are going to be the things that are going towards the center away from the bone in between the actual osteocytes. The osteocytes are going to be these dark kind of colored thing and these extensions off of them. Then there is going to be lacuna that you can't see. Those would run kind of with the cell alongside of it. So those would run kind of in this kind of network. My mouse just connection lost on me. Hang on one second. Okay, connected. There we go. Here's another kind of example of the same bone tissue. Another one. Another one. All showing kind of the same stuff. So, as we go through this, I'm going to be looking on page 173. So if you look on page 173, it's going to take you through all of these definitions. I think the definitions are kind of confusing to read through it in a word format. But so starting on compact bone tissue. So compact bone tissue is found beneath the periosteum of all bones and make up the bulk of the diaphyses of long bones. So here's the periosteum. Compact bone is going to be found on the inside of it, and it's going to be the main part of those diaphyses. Compact bone tissue is composed of repeating structural units called osteons or Haversian systems. So here's those osteons. So we have all of these osteons coming together to make compact bone. Each osteon consists of concentric lamellae arranged around a central canal or Haversian canal. So again, the concentric lamellae are things that have the same center. So all of these in a circle that feed off of the same blood vessel. Resembling the growth rings of a tree, the concentric lamellae are circular plates of mineralized extracellular matrix of increasing diameter surrounding a small network of blood vessels and nerves located in the central canal. So lamellae, again, is just a thin layer or membrane. So that's going to be all of the tissue in between the actual cell. Between the concentric lamellae are small spaces called lacunae, which contain osteocytes. Radiating in all directions from the lacunae are tiny canaliculi. So lacuna are going to be the spaces where the actual cell sits. So they're the spaces that run all along kind of where the actual cell is. And the canaliculi are going to be those spaces where the projections are. So canaliculi are the spider-like projections. Lacunae are going to be the actual spaces where the osteocyte sits. Inside the canaliculi are slender finger-like processes of the osteocytes. So again, it's important to remember that the space is the lacuna. It's filled with an osteocyte. Canaliculi is a space filled with projections of an osteocyte. So this system provides many routes for nutrients and oxygen to reach the osteocytes and removal of waste. Again, bone is a static tissue, so as you learn how to do different things, or you become heavier or lighter, or you're doing more or less, the lines of stress are going to change over time. So the areas between neighboring osteons that contain lamellae are called interstitial lamellae. So again, here would be an osteon, here's an osteon, here's an osteon. All of these tissues that aren't actually going concentric with a central canal are called interstitial lamellae. Interstitial lamellae are fragments of older osteons that have been partially destroyed during the bone rebuilding or growth process. Blood vessels and nerves from the periosteum penetrate the compact bone through perforating or Volkmann's canals. So that's going to be this stuff right here. They are the periosteum is going to be connected to the bone by those Sharpie's fibers. That's going to be this stuff. So spongy bone tissue is different. This is going to also be known as trabecular or cancellous bone tissue, and it does not contain osteons. This stuff is always going to be located on the interior of the bone, protected by a covering of compact bone. So this, instead of having osteons, has something called trabeculae. So trabeculae are going to have spaces that you can see without a microscope. So with an unaided eye, you're able to look at this and see these kind of framework patterns. The spaces are going to be filled with red bone marrow that produce blood cells and yellow marrow in other bones. Each trabeculae is going to each area of spongy bone is usually going to be the epiphyses and the metaphyses. There's going to be a very narrow portion that lays underneath in the diaphyses as well. A lot of words early in the morning for me. So spongy bone is going to be different than compact bone in two main areas. So first of all, spongy bone tissue is going to be light. Which is good because if our bones were all compact bone, our bones would be extremely, extremely heavy. The trabeculae of spongy bone support and protect the marrow, and so spongy bone is going to have marrow where compact bone is not. So it is going to be the site where hemopoiesis occurs in adults. Looking at other things through this chapter, I'm going to take one step back and go to page 172 in your book. There's 4 different types of bone cells. So these are very important to know. So the first is going to be these osteoprogenitor cells. So genic means producing, osteo means bone. So these are going to be the bone cells that undergo cell division, and they are going to turn into osteoblasts. So these are essentially like bone stem cells. So they are going to turn into osteoblasts. Osteoblasts are going to be cells that help build bone. So they synthesize and secrete collagen fibers and other organic components needed to build the extracellular matrix of bone tissue. They're going to be the ones that help calcify bone tissue as well. Eventually, they are going to become trapped in their secretions, like this area, and they're going to turn into osteocytes. Osteocytes are also known as mature bone cells and are the main cells in bone tissue and just kind of maintain bone the way that it is. An osteoclast is going to be this gigantic cell of like 50 monocytes that are going to be concentrated on the endosteum of the bone, so the inside, and their job is actually going to be cell destruction. So they break down bone extracellular matrix and resorb it. So resorption is kind of this process of the osteoclast breaking bone down and getting rid of. The reason we have these is because they're going to help regulate our blood calcium level. So they're going to break bone tissue down in response to having low calcium level or in response to other hormones. All right, moving on. I'm going to jump forward to 6.4 on page 175. So blood and nerve supply of bone. So bone is richly supplied with blood. There are periosteal arteries that are going to flow through here. Again, we have these perforating canals from a periosteal artery and vein that are going to go through these Volkmann's or perforating canals to feed the different Haversian systems. So near the center of a diaphysis is something called a nutrient artery. It's going to pass through an area called a nutrient foramen. So this is going to be the big main blood supply of a long bone. The ends of the long bones are supplied by metaphyseal and epiphyseal arteries, which are going to be going in those respective places. The metaphyseal artery is going to go in through the metaphysis. Epiphyseal artery is going to go through the epiphysis. So the diaphyses one is called the nutrient artery and vein. Moving on to bone formation on page 176. So what I'm really concerned that you know about here is the difference between essentially interstitial and oppositional growth. So the first word that we're going to talk about is intramembranous ossification. So this is going to be bone that forms directly within mesenchyme. As you remember from chapter 4, mesenchyme is like fetal tissue essentially. The second type of ossification is going to be called enchondral ossification, which is bone forming within hyaline cartilage. So this is going to be bone formation within a fetus. So as you look through intramembranous ossification, I'm not concerned that you know the step-by-step areas. I just am concerned that you know the different definition of intramembranous ossification and then enchondral ossification. So if you look on page 177, there's a good picture of enchondral ossification. So this is essentially how fetal bone tissue is made from hyaline cartilage into bone. As you continue to go forward, we are going to go to page 178. These are some other terms that you're going to need to know. We've talked about them before. So enchondral growth and intramembranous growth is going to be the two types of bone formation in the embryo and fetus. As we move forward, you're going to have interstitial and oppositional growth. So as you look at growth in length, we're going to be talking about growth that happens at the growth plate or epiphyseal plate. Again, I'm not concerned that you necessarily know these steps, but what I do want you to know is where this happens at and which directions it's going. So the chondrocytes are going to be mature cartilage cells. So this epiphyseal plate is actually a layer of cartilage. So these chondrocytes are going to undergo division and essentially secrete extracellular matrix as they do so. There's an area called the zone of hypertrophic cartilage. This is going to be a bunch of extra chondrocytes, and as you continue to move forward, you're going to see chondrocytes that have died, and then the extracellular matrix around them has calcified. So if you looked at epiphyseal plate histology, you can see all of these different kind of zones. So zone 1 is going to be the zone of resting cartilage. So this is just normal cartilage. Zone 2 is going to be the perforating zone where you have all of these chondrocytes that are undergoing interstitial growth, meaning they're getting longer as they divide and secrete extracellular matrix. Number 3 is going to be just maturing cells. So you'll notice that they're really tiny here. So you have a layer of normal cartilage. Then in this proliferating area, you see all of these cells kind of dividing. And the hypertrophic cartilage, you see those cells start to get larger. So we've gone from these little tiny blips to these larger cells. And then the next zone is going to be the zone of calcified cartilage, where these chondrocytes start to die. And now you're going to have bone tissue essentially. So this is going to be how interstitial growth occurs. So the bone is getting longer. Here's another one. So resting zone or just kind of normal hyaline cartilage. Then you see these cells start to divide and become more numerous. Then they get larger in this hypertrophy areas. And then these chondrocytes are going to turn into osteocytes. The lacunae are starting to be formed. And then as you go, you end up having bone down here. Here's just another example of it for pictures. Here's another histology slide of it. So resting zone, you can see them proliferating here. Here they're getting hypertrophic and then dying, and then they turn into bone tissue. So that that is kind of an example of that. But the thing that I want you to know is, as you see, here's the epiphysis, metaphysis, and diaphyses. The bone grows towards the diaphyses. So cartilage is replaced by bone on the diaphysis side of things. So it doesn't grow this way, it grows longer this way. Moving on is going to be bone remodeling. So I'm on page 180. I gotta grab a sip of water, hang on. All right, so bone is constantly remodeling itself. So bone remodeling is the ongoing replacement of bone tissue by new bone tissue, involving bone resorption by osteoclasts and bone deposition by osteoblasts. So at any given time, about 5% of your total bone mass in your body is being remodeled. Remodeling is going to be triggered by things like exercise, sedentary lifestyle, changes in diet. I'm also going to add in different hormonal influences. So the factors that affect bone growth and remodeling, number one is going to be minerals. So you obviously can't build bone without minerals like calcium and phosphorus. We also need things like magnesium, fluoride, and manganese. So if you don't have those minerals, it's really hard to form new bone. Vitamin A is needed because that is going to stimulate the activity of osteoblasts. Vitamin C is going to be needed for the synthesis of collagen. So you may have heard of a disease called like scurvy before. Scurvy is when you don't have enough vitamin C, so you don't get collagen formation, which makes your bones extremely brittle. And then vitamin A you need to stimulate those osteoblasts. So turning the page. You'll also learn that vitamin D helps build bone by increasing the absorption of calcium from foods in the GI tract. We've talked about that in our skin chapter and before. And we also are going to need different hormones. So we're going to talk about these hormones in depth next year. Okay, I want to start by talking about... Oh man, my mouse died again. Apparently need to do a new battery for it. The first hormones I want to talk about are going to be parathyroid hormone and calcitonin. Oh, there it goes. So these two hormones you are going to need to know inside and out. So I would just plan on learning them well the first time. They will absolutely be on your tests, so you are absolutely going to need to know these two hormones. There's a picture on page 186 in your chapter that talks about this as well, but your normal blood calcium level should be about 10 when they measure it on a lab test. So any time that it rises above or below, we're going to have some different changes. So to start, we're going to start, let's see here, we'll talk about it if it gets high first. So let's say you chug a gallon of milk, your blood calcium level is going to rise. As it rises and it gets close to being above 10, your thyroid gland is going to release a hormone called calcitonin. So the job of calcitonin is to lower your blood calcium. I always remember calcitonin puts calcium in bones because it ends in IN. So it does this in kind of a few different ways. So number one, it's going to start taking the calcium that's floating around your bloodstream and it's going to deposit it in your bones. So it's going to lower blood calcium by giving that calcium someplace to go, so it's going to go into bones. It's also going to tell your kidneys, I don't like that this image doesn't include your GI tract because it does that too, but it's going to tell your kidneys that you don't need to save any calcium. So it would get rid of calcium in your urine, and it would tell your GI tract that you don't need to intake any more calcium as well. So those three things combined are going to help lower your blood calcium level in your blood. The opposite of that is falling blood calcium levels. The parathyroid gland is going to secrete something called parathyroid hormone into your bloodstreams. So as our blood calcium falls, we need to raise that blood calcium level up again because it's vital for any type of muscle contraction, including like heart contraction, skeletal muscle contraction. So parathyroid hormone is going to increase calcium uptake in the intestines, increase uptake in the kidneys, and it's going to start breaking down your bones. So it's going to stimulate the release of calcium through that osteoclast activity so that your blood calcium starts to go up. So very, very, very important that you know these two hormones for sure. Other important hormones to talk about are going to be things like human growth hormone and insulin-like growth factors. Human growth hormone is going to be secreted by your pituitary gland, and it does exactly what its name says, which is to increase the growth of all body tissues. As bone is a body tissue, human growth hormone would also help build bone. It helps build bone through secreting something called an insulin-like growth factors. So human growth hormone stimulates the secretion of insulin-like growth factors, and insulin-like growth factors are going to be secreted by the liver, bones, and other tissues, and it's going to stimulate osteoblasts by increasing the synthesis of proteins. So human growth hormone is secreted because we want to grow our body and all of our tissues. When that's secreted, that's going to cause the secretion of IGFs. The IGFs are going to increase osteoblastic activity and thus build bones. T3 and T4 are other thyroid hormones outside of calcitonin. They are going to be secreted from the thyroid gland, and it's going to promote normal bone growth by stimulating osteoblasts again. So T3, T4, and IGFs are going to all be things that are going to help stimulate those osteoblasts. Insulin, which is secreted by the pancreas, promotes normal bone growth by increasing the synthesis of bone proteins. Sex hormones, estrogens and testosterone, they are going to be responsible for kind of those growth spurts of bones. So estrogen is secreted by the ovaries in women, and testosterone is secreted by the testes in men. They are going to both stimulate osteoblasts and promote the sudden growth spurt that happens during your teenage years. Now, the problem with this is that it's also going to shut down your epiphyseal plates around age 18 to 21. So there is, obviously, everyone I think understands a point in time where you no longer get taller. That's usually after puberty is complete, and after puberty is complete, that epiphyseal plate is closed. It closes because of estrogen and testosterone. Parathyroid hormone, we've talked about. Calcitonin, we've talked about. The other thing to talk about is exercise. Exercise stimulates osteoblasts. So the more you do weight-bearing exercise, the more your bones are going to build. That being said, I feel like a lot of older people, when they hear exercise for bone density, I'm talking about the Esthers and Mabels of the world, they go to things like water aerobics. Now, water aerobics is great that you're exercising and moving. However, water aerobics does not provide you any impact. So you're going to lose the bone stimulating effect of exercise if you're not doing things in gravity. The most common sites for like an osteoporotic break and osteoporosis is going to be that loss of bone tissue. So not enough bone tissue is going to be like your hip and then also your wrists. So the other thing I tell my elderly clientele is to make sure they're doing load-bearing activity even in their wrists. So push-ups off a wall if they can, push-ups or like dips if they can do it, making sure that they are also doing load-bearing in their hands. So as you age, some interesting things happen. When you're born until the end of adolescence, more bone tissue is going to be produced than destroyed. So as soon as you hit that young adulthood and your epiphyseal plate closes, the rate of deposition and resorption tend to kind of level out. As your sex hormones decrease as you get older, especially in women after menopause, bone mass decrease occurs because bone resorption by osteoclasts is going to be more than bone deposition. So as soon as women have that estrogen and progesterone and all that drop after menopause, their bone resorption rate kind of goes through the roof. So the loss usually begins starting after age 30 in females, accelerates around the age of 45, and continues until as much of 30% of the calcium in bones is lost by age 70. Once bone loss begins in females, about 8% of bone mass is lost every 10 years. In males, this calcium loss doesn't typically begin until after the age of 60, and only about 3% of bone mass is lost every 10 years. So for women especially, it's extremely important to continue load-bearing activity so that you're going to save as much bone as possible. And it's very, very, very vital for women to do as much bone building as they can before they hit age 30, because that's when they have the advantage to actually build up bone, because you're going to start losing it every year thereafter. So, I mean, I think everyone understands calcium is important for bone growth, but the problem is women, I don't think, really start to be serious about it until, I don't want to say it's too late, but until you're in a position where you can't really make any positive strides. All you're really doing is preventing loss. So it's extremely important to build up your bones when you're young. It's important to have a very strong bone mass going into getting older, especially for women after the age of 30. And for men, you have a little bit more time, but there are osteoporotic men as well. It's possible. It's a thing. So we already talked about osteoarthritis, and we talked about like DJD. The other things that we should talk about as far as bone disorders on page 188, I would read through this and I would be familiar with the information, especially osteoporosis. We've already talked about osteoarthritis. The other things we should talk about, one is going to be osteomyelitis. So osteomyelitis is a bone infection. So this is going to be super high fever, pain, nausea, pus formation, warmth over bone. It's usually caused by Staph aureus, and it usually happens through either like you had orthopedic surgery of some sort or some type of wound. Now, boys are more susceptible to this than females are, primarily because boys are rough and tough and they tend to injure themselves and they get more scraped knees and all that stuff than women do. But they can also, other ways to get osteomyelitis would be like UTIs, that abscesses that you don't take care of, that sinus infection that you don't take care of, or also through diabetes, so poor wound healing with diabetes. The other thing is going to be osteosarcoma. So this is, sarcoma is a connective tissue tumor. Osteo designates bone, obviously. So this is a bone cancer that primarily affects osteoblasts and occurs most often in teenagers during their growth spurt. So this is really important to know because usually people complain of pain when they're growing, so a lot of times this gets written off just as growing pains. Show you what this looks like. So this is an example of osteosarcoma. So as you see in the book, it says that it's usually in the metaphyses of the femur, or the tibia, or the humerus. Sometimes it can happen at the fibular head as well. So this is an example. Here's another one. So here's that classic metaphyses presentation. Here's the humerus, another classic kind of presentation of that. Here's what kind of a histological picture of that would look like. You see all of this tumor kind of around the metaphysis. Here's another 3D photo of what that looks like. Another really good one. So it's going to be this increase in bone tissue. There's another cancer that I'm just going to show you. Chondrosarcoma is another bone cancer that someone can get. This one's usually like in the bone. You'll notice there's less outside growth of all of this, but you see a lot of cancer within the actual bone itself. There's some other terms that you've probably heard of. Ewing's is a very, very, very popular childhood cancer. Look at that. Oofta. Here's a good photo of what this looks like. So basically, they will sometimes fracture their bone for no reason, and that's why. But the area gets really painful and swollen, and then they take a X-ray of it, and they can find it. So this usually happens around that knee joint is the most common place for that. Here's a good photo showing you a picture of it. I'm taking out cancer chunk. That's going to be that thigh bone. Ooh, look at that tumor surrounding that bone. So a lot of times they have to amputate these bones that have these tumors growing around them. So either kids will lose a limb. Sometimes if it's of like the femur head like this, they can put in like a fake, they can put in like do like a joint replacement almost. Sometimes if it's the fibula, they'll just take the fibula out. So you really don't even need your fibula. I think it only accounts for, they say 10% of weight bearing. So they would just take it out at that point and take out all the surrounding musculature as well. Other terms would be, let's go back to this, osteoporosis. So osteoporotic bone, what you'll notice is we start to lose some of these trabeculae that are running through it. So here's what a healthy bone would look like. Here's what an osteoporotic bone would look like. Same thing, here's what a normal bone looks like. Osteoporotic bone, you'll notice we start to lose some of those trabecular patterns. When you lose patterns like this, it makes you very susceptible to compression fractures or just fractures in general. Another example, we do have an osteoporotic skeleton in our class, so a lot of the bones, you'll notice on some of them, are like a lot lighter than the other ones, and you'll even be able to see this decrease in kind of patterns. So you can check that out. Osteoporosis versus osteopenia is another good example. So osteopenia is like kind of the step between osteoporosis and normal. So osteopenia is kind of the middle ground between these. We calculate these based on a DEXA scan. So the DEXA scan is how they calculate how much bone mass you have. So it measures how dense your bone tissue is. So they take your age, your height, your weight, your sex, they plug it into like a formula, and it calculates how dense your bones are. So it would give you this nice reading of if you were having any issues, and they'll give you kind of a rating on that. So that's how you detect those two diseases. The ratings are kind of these numbers. So basically, it's going to be -1 to 1 is normal, essentially. Osteoporosis would be -2.5 or more on that reading. Okay, I'm not really going to go over fractures because I'll let you read through that, but obviously a fracture is when a bone isn't strong enough and it breaks. There's going to be table 6.1 on page 184 that can give you some examples of fractures. I'm not going to test you on specific types of fractures. What I will tell you though is that you can tell when a bone has been fractured because it's going to form a callus. So the only part of a fracture stuff I really want you to understand is that it forms a callus at the end of it. So on page 183 on 2B, you'll notice that there is a hard callus that is going to last about 3 to 4 months, and oftentimes an area of broken bone is going to be harder than it was before. So if you looked at an x-ray, you could tell previously where a bone had been broken. So initially it's going to form this callus kind of as it heals. Later in life, you can have evidence of a fracture for years and years and years. If you look at x-rays of abused people, you can tell if you were to take, you know, x-rays of a child. A lot of times they'll pick up on this stuff at the ER because the kid is there for a broken bone, and if they x-ray other bones, they can see all of these calluses that have formed in pretty typical sites of abuse. So there is a kind of evidence always on your bones that you have been, you know, subject to trauma or had issues with broken bones before. They can always look and pretty much tell. Oh, here's a good one. Here would be some more calluses from previous broken bones. So your bone will always kind of be forever changed due to a break. So it'll always be there. I think that is all that I have for you. I will get your worksheets out to you as soon as I can. Go ahead and let me know if you have any questions, but otherwise I will see you on Tuesday, March 1st. So have a good day, everyone.